everyone, my name's John Lustria. I'm the Director of Education at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And today we're out here on Antietam National Battlefield to talk about the story of one wounded soldier in particular, that of Patrick Doyle of the 69th New York, part of the famed Irish Brigade. And we're talking about him today as a part of the latest edition of our On Tour series. We're talking about him today because we actually have a specimen of his on display at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It's on loan to us from the National Museum of Health and Medicine, an organization that was actually founded during the American Civil War. And as we go along today, we'll talk a little bit about how we came to have that, how the Museum of Health and Medicine came into being, and why we have that some of those bones today. But I want to talk about his story first, and that's what brings us to Antietam. We're standing at the site where he actually gets wounded. So, as I mentioned, he's part of the famed Irish Brigade, and here at the Battle of Antietam, they're tasked with taking this Confederate position. So, more or less where the cameras are located is where the Confederate defenders were. Well, they were really kind of down in the lane here. The Union attack and the 69th New York is coming kind of directly at you, at the camera, from the fields behind me here. And they're tasked with taking this position. Now, this bloody lane here is sort of a naturally formed trench. It was a farm lane, sort of a bypass between a few different toll roads. So over time, it got worn down quite a bit, and the embankments became sort of a natural trench that the Confederate defenders took advantage of. So, the 69th New York is on the far right end of the Irish Brigade line, and the far left end is down there several hundred yards near where the Irish Brigade monument itself is located. So if you're wondering why I'm not by the Irish Brigade monument, that's why, because the 69th New York is on the opposite end of the line. They're advancing up from the Roulette Farm, which is just down that farm lane a little while. So, Patrick Doyle and company arrive sort of maybe about 100 yards out, maybe towards the top of that next rise or a little further down, and they exchange several volleys with the Confederate defenders. After firing about 5 to 6 organized volleys, then they mount a concentrated charge against this location. But they only make it to about 30 yards away from where I'm standing right now when the Confederate fire becomes too much, and they end up falling back to their previous position. Now, eventually, subsequent Union attacks end up successfully taking this position, but the Irish Brigade itself doesn't end up leading the successful attack. And after coming up against such a strong defensive position, they pay for their efforts heavily. All units in the Irish Brigade suffer heavily, and the 69th New York is no exception. They take about 61% casualties. Of the kind of 330 soldiers it entered battle with, there were about 44 killed and 152 wounded, which works out to about 196 casualties. One of those, as I've alluded to, was Patrick Doyle. Now, he enlisted in 1861 at the age of 29 into Company D of the 69th New York, and somewhere out in the fields in front of us here, well, behind me, in front of you, he was shot in the right arm, kind of elbow area. We can't know how long he actually lay here on the field waiting for medical attention, but we do know that the Battle of Antietam was the first application of the Letterman Plan. This is an organized system of medical evacuation designed to get wounded soldiers off the field and into field hospitals quickly and efficiently. The Ambulance Corps debuts at the Battle of Antietam, and we know that within 24 hours of the end of the battle, of the bloodiest single day in American history, 23,000 casualties, all wounded soldiers were off the field of battle and into field hospitals. So we don't know how long Patrick Doyle lay out there with a bullet somewhere in his arm, elbow region, but we do know that within 24 hours of his wounding, he was off the field and taken off by an ambulance to be taken to a field hospital. We're going to go to that field hospital next, and that is the Pry House, one of our 3 locations. We're going to talk a little bit about the treatment he received, and we'll follow his story from there. We are here in the Pry Barn on Antietam National Battlefield to continue the story of Patrick Doyle, a wounded Union soldier, part of the 69th New York, part of the famous Irish Brigade. Now, as we previously just saw, he was wounded in the Bloody Lane, the Sunken Road portion, the fighting at Antietam, and he was brought here via an ambulance, much like what you see behind me. An ambulance of the Ambulance Corps brought him here to the Pry Barn. And we know he was brought here because this was one of 3 field hospitals which were wounded from Richardson's division were to be sent to. But we know he came here because we know he was received by Surgeon J.H. Taylor, who we know for a fact was here at the Pry Barn. And we know that he was received by J.H. Taylor because we have his case history in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. Now, what is the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion? Well, it's a huge reason why we know so much about Civil War medicine, especially what happened to wounded Union soldiers. It was initiated, it didn't get printed until long after the Civil War, but it was initiated by Surgeon General William Hammond in 1862. He issued his famous Circular Number 2, where he told all surgeons, Union surgeons, that if you find anything interesting, basically send it to Washington, D.C., to the newly created Army Medical Museum, and the reward is basically you'll get published at the end of the war. And what doctor doesn't like to be published, right? So this is a huge incentive. And the idea behind it is that we would gather knowledge so that we could learn from the Civil War based on all the thousands, tens of thousands cases that we now know that they would encounter. And along with those case reports that the surgeons were supposed to take, they were also to send medical specimens, if applicable. And that's why we have the bones that we do have from John Delaney, Patrick Doyle, and R.P. Hughes, who we're talking about in this series of on-tour videos. For the purposes of this video, we're concerned about what happens to Patrick Doyle. So we start to know what happens to him in a little bit greater detail once he comes into contact with Army surgeons. And that would happen here at a field hospital. At this field hospital in particular. We know that he was one of some 400 to 700 wounded Union soldiers who were treated right here in the Pry Barn and on the surrounding grounds. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to fit 400 people in this space, so you would be seen here and then likely sent outside to wait. So the entire area around this barn and the Pry House would have been covered by wounded Union soldiers. And the field hospitals are the second step of the Letterman plan that you heard me mention at our previous location. And field hospitals are where the doctors kind of consult the injuries, and assess what needs to be done. And for Patrick Doyle, who was wounded in the right arm elbow area, you would think that that would be an amputation. But from the case history, he does not actually receive any surgical procedures here. It would have been bandaged and, hoping that it would recover. So, and really all we have in terms of, where he was injured in this region in the case history is when he was checked in here at the Pry House, he had a, quote, wound of right arm. Not terribly descriptive. So we don't know if the bullet had actually hit bone or not. Maybe it wasn't necessary, at the time, or the doctors didn't feel it was. Even though amputation is the most common surgical procedure of the war, they're not just chopping limbs off willy-nilly. They're kind of doing careful consideration, even in mass casualty situations. In Antietam, it's about as bad of a mass casualty situation as you can get. 23,000 casualties in a single day. So we don't know too much about what happened to him while he was here, other than he did not have surgery. We do know that on September 23, 24, somewhere in that neighborhood, he was then sent from here to Frederick, Maryland. So about a week or so after the battle, when it was determined he was strong enough to travel, he likely would have been transported on a wagon, much like this, over the South Mountain Range, making the agonizing trip over to Frederick, which would have taken the better part of a day. and we will pick up his story, what happens to Patrick when he makes it to Frederick, Maryland. Here we are standing at the location of the site of General Hospital number 6, one of the 2 areas in Frederick where Patrick Doyle was treated. Now, General Hospital number 6 itself no longer stands, but this is the location on the 500 block of North Market Street. Initially, Patrick Doyle was brought to General Hospital number 5, the Visitation Academy and the Novitiate, over about a few blocks southeast of where I'm standing right now. That was the largest hospital area here in Frederick following the battles of Antietam. They ended up treating about 1,500 patients there at that location with a max capacity of about 500 or so. So he was initially brought there, underwent treatment there for a while. He was brought there on September 24th, about a week after his wounding at the Battle of Antietam. It was there that Surgeon Henry S. Hewitt did the first surgical procedure that Patrick Doyle had experienced so far. He did an excision of his elbow joint. Now, an excision is not the same as an amputation. So an amputation, you cut the whole limb off. An excision is an attempt to try and save the limb by taking out the damaged bits of bone. So it's very likely that Patrick Doyle's arm was shattered there. Some of the bone was shattered in his elbow joint. So at the time of the Civil War, they didn't have what they needed to effectively put that back together to get it to heal properly. So they picked what they would do in an excision procedure. They would take out the excess bits of bone in the hopes that maybe, it might not be as strong as it was before, but that it might be able to heal and that he would retain the use of both arms. So Surgeon Henry S. Hewitt performs that procedure in early October. So about a week or so after he arrived, but that procedure didn't kind of take properly. The arm wasn't healing properly, so they subsequently amputated the arm on October 2nd. So he was without his kind of forearm here. He would still have had the kind of upper portion of his right arm. When the arm then didn't heal properly again, they tried another resection, but the damage was too great still, so it turned into a further amputation of the arm, this time near the shoulder, this time on December 4th, so about 2 months after the first amputation. So they're keeping these soldiers under careful observation. 2 days after Patrick Doyle had the second amputation, which took his arm off near the shoulder, on December 6th, he was reported as comfortable. So it seemed like he was finally on the right track. Later that month in December, on December 29th, Doyle was transferred here, not to this building, because this postdates the Civil War, but to this location on North Market Street, to General Hospital number 6. General Hospital number 6, one of the smaller of the facilities. It only treated 497 patients with a max capacity of 225. And we know he was sent here. There are only 2 hospital sites with General Hospital number 6. We have this location here, 520 North Market, and then 517 North Market across the street. That site ended up closing first, and Patrick Doyle was actually one of the last patients to be discharged from Frederick period after Antietam. He's ultimately discharged on February 5th, 1863. So he didn't leave here. He had been in Frederick basically since late September. He's finally leaving in the following February. And this, of the two hospital sites, was the only hospital site to stay open into February. So that's how we know he was here. He subsequently joined the Veteran Reserve Corps, and that was a unit that if you had had an amputation, you could still continue to serve in the Army, still continue to draw a paycheck, which was important for some of these people, especially if you were missing a limb. Depending on what your profession was, it would be hard to go home and be a farmer with only one limb, or a blacksmith, or whatever it was. We don't know what Patrick Doyle did in civilian life, but he enlisted in the Veteran Reserve Corps to continue to help out the Army, do clerical desk work and things. So soon after he left here in February of 1863, joined the Veteran Reserve Corps, and he finally left the Army entirely on December 9th of 1864. And again, these case histories come to us thanks to the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. Surgeon General of the United States Army, William Hammond, issued a circular to surgeons to send medical specimens and case reports to the Army Medical Museum so that they would be published after the war and that we could learn from the tragedy that was the Civil War. And so Patrick Doyle, part of his arm elbow joint area, that was one of the items that was sent to the Army Medical Museum and is today on display in our museum, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And he ends up surviving his wounds. So even though he survives the multiple amputations and resections, he survives long after the war and ends up drawing a pension. So Patrick Doyle, of the three individual soldiers who we've done videos on today, he's the only one of the three that goes on to survive after the war and successfully draw a pension for his injuries. So that concludes the story of Patrick Doyle. If you enjoyed these videos, please like the videos and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's the best way to stay up to date with all that we do. Be sure to check out the other individual stories we've done from our On Tour series for this month. And if you want to take your support of our programming to the next level, consider becoming a member. For as low as $25 a year, you support programming like this. So thank you so much for tuning in with us today, and we'll see you next time.